Chapter 11 Patrick O'Malley. Heedless of other pedestrians, Jim McVeigh walked toward Georgetown University. The sinking sun still held a spring warmth, but an evening breeze played along O Street, ruffling Jim's thatch of black hair and plucking at his clothes. Automatically, Jim buttoned his white all-weather topcoat. His thoughts were on Rita and this new baffling development of the FBI. A single investigation of a United States senator by a federal agency was extraordinary enough, but to become the magnet for two sets of government sleuths was unheard of. Most certainly, he thought, the FBI questioning had been prompted by Mark Hollenbach. Never before had Jim known of a president ordering an investigation of his proposed vice presidential candidate. McVeigh walked with his head down, his eyes on the uneven brick sidewalks of Georgetown. Mark had a colossal gall, he thought, sending FBI men all around to question Jim's friends. The very idea was insulting. And now, of course, the FBI knew about Rita, and soon, he surmised, a formal government report, as colorless as a traffic summons, would be on the president's desk. He could imagine the language. Subject has visited the apartment of a Miss Rita Krasicki, a widow employed at the Democratic National Committee, numerous times over a 2-year period. Mrs. Krasicki refused to discuss the nature of their relations. Subject's visits customarily at night. A neighbor, R. Paul Grissom, an attorney, reports that subject often looks up and down the street before leaving Miss Krasicki's domicile. When interviewed, Miss Krasicki became angry. An emotion, thought McVeigh, which could not approach the flashing rage of President Hollenbach when he read the document. And so Jim's brief fling at the vice presidency would come to a tawdry and abrupt end. Rita? Jim felt a willing of sympathy for her, but he noted that his feeling was passionless. If their affair hadn't been over anyway, it had died forever in the little front parlor. Love might survive 100 torments, but lust waned deeply under duress. Mark's impressment of the FBI was a piece of the gaudy grand concept of Camp David and the sputtering explosions over his supposed prosecutors. Jim's thoughts, a tangle of knots, were cut by a voice from the radio. A sweatered young man, probably a Georgetown University student, was standing at the corner curb holding a tiny portable radio near his ear. Jim thought fleetingly that the youth must have eardrums of lead, for the volume was turned high. An announcer's voice was blaring. We interrupt this program to bring you a special news bulletin. The White House has just announced that President Hollenbach will meet with Premier Zhuchek of Russia on April 20th in Stockholm. An authoritative source says the summit conference will deal with the possibility of a united nuclear front against the threat of Red China, which last month detonated its fifth Dragon bomb, a hydrogen weapon thought to be of a magnitude of 75 million tons of TNT. Repeating, President Hollenbach will meet with Premier Zhuchek on April 20th in Stockholm, Sweden. Stay tuned to WRC for more details on the 6 o'clock news program. Jim stood still for a moment, and once more he felt a twinge of apprehension, an increasingly common experience recently. Was time running out? In only about 3 weeks, Hollenbach was to confront the stoic and patriarchal Russian premier in Sweden. Jim wondered if Hollenbach had stipulated the site, and if so, whether this was another cunning offshoot of the grand concept for a union with Scandinavia. Perhaps of a kind with Mark Hollenbach's choice of a vice president whose wife happened to be of Swedish stock. Suddenly, the thought struck McVeigh. President Hollenbach must not be allowed to go into this conference with Zhuchek. My God, Mark might be capable of anything. Who knew what fantastic secret agreement might emerge from such a meeting? Zhuchek, a patient, steel-nerved negotiator, utterly devoted to Russia's self-interest, versus Hollenbach, whose once brilliant mind was now obsessed with fancied tormentors and played like a child's toy with the blocks of destiny. The meeting had to be prevented somehow, some way. And who else would attempt to stop it besides McVeigh? Who else, indeed, even suspected that McVeigh knew? He had to act at once. He knew it now. His own small concerns no longer mattered. Now it was a case of the country. The realization brought a faint smile to his face. Jim McVeigh, playboy turned patriot, country before self. All right, he thought. It may be corny, but it's true. Do something. Now. Still in the trance of thought, McVeigh looked uncertainly about him. A block away, he saw a corner telephone booth. He walked quickly to it. He had to tell Martha he would be delayed. He dialed and waited, but there was no answer at the McLean home. Jim retrieved the dime, then consulted a small memo book which he always carried. In it, he found the unlisted home telephone number of Vice President O'Malley. He dropped in the coin and dialed. Mrs. Grace O'Malley, her voice as bright as a warbler's, expressed surprise. Not many important people wanted to talk to Pat these days, she said, but she called her husband to the telephone. O'Malley said he was just having his first belt of bourbon for the day. Urgent? Nothing was urgent anymore, he said wistfully, but sure, come on over and have one before dinner. Settled in his car, Jim remembered the gray sedan. He kept his eyes on the rearview mirror as he drove. There was no gray sedan, but he soon became aware of a black one. He turned twice to test, and each time the black car turned up behind him. Jim drove to the garage on L Street behind the Statler Hilton Hotel, shoved $1 in the attendant's hand, and then ran out the back through the long, covered passageway to K Street. He took the first taxi at the cab stand and promised the driver to tip extra for speed on the way to the Capitol Hill area. O'Malley lived in a renovated 2-story stone house a block behind the Congressional Hotel, within easy walking distance of his office on the Senate side of the Capitol. Jim was relieved to find, when alighting, that no moving black sedan was in sight. Grace O'Malley, a little woman with merry gray eyes and a quick laugh, hooked an arm through Jim's as she welcomed him in. "He's in the library," she said, probably thinking murderous things about sports arenas and contractors. The library door was opened. Vice President Patrick O'Malley heaved himself about of a well-worn easy chair. His left hand was fastened with a glass, bourbon and water. His right hand, large and fleshy, came out to shake McVeigh's. Pat O'Malley had a long, jowly face which drooped comfortably like that of a basset hound. His paunch was solid and conspicuous, and he moved slowly. To meet Pat O'Malley for the first time was to relax immediately, as though one were entering a familiar saloon where the talk would be frank and never too refined. O'Malley pumped McVeigh's hand several times. "You're a surprise, Jim," he said. "I thought the young Scot would be out in Wisconsin, making sure he's got the mixed job." "I'll admit I've got the bug now, Pat," said McVeigh, "but only after you said you wouldn't run again. Pat, I've never told you I'm sorry, but I sincerely am. You got an unlucky break." O'Malley waved his big hand. "None of that, young fellow. That's all over and done with. These days I'm wondering how an old Pole goes about earning an honest living, for a change. Drink?" Jim nodded. "Scotch on the rocks." O'Malley shook his head, the jowls swinging lightly. "They raise these Iowa boys on bourbon and branch water, and then they come east and get seduced by Scotch." The vice president poured a drink from a row of bottles on the lower bookshelf, handed the glass to Jim, then lumbered back to his easy chair. It was dusk outside now, and O'Malley turned on a floor lamp beside his reading chair. Crowded bookshelves lined 2 walls of the room, and the upper paneled walls were thick with autographed pictures of politicians of both parties. O'Malley, noting McVeigh's eyes on the old pictures, held his glass toward the rows of blurred faces. Not many live ones up there," he said. "I've been around a long time." The vice president grunted, leaned forward heavily toward a cigar box resting on an end table, and took out a cigar sheathed in a silverish foil. He unwrapped it slowly, bit off the end, spat the fragment into a large green ashtray, and fussed with the lighting. At last he blew out a donut of smoke, and eased back in his chair. "The image is tall against Pat," thought McVeigh, "with that fat cigar and those sagging jowls. He looks like a ward boss who'd played it low and crafty, but he isn't that way at all." "I'd offer you one, Jim," said O'Malley, "but I know you don't have the habit. Well, young fellow, what's so urgent?" "Pat, there's no use puttering around the edges," said Jim. Something frightening is happening here in Washington, and if what I suspect is true, this country is in deep trouble. And what do you suspect? I suspect, Jim paused, then lunged ahead. I suspect on the basis of personal observation and some collateral evidence that President Hollenbach is suffering a severe mental ailment. Jim intended to go on, but he stopped involuntarily, checked by the sound of his own words. He had thought and brooded over this thing for days and sketched it without names for Grissom, but this was the first time he'd said it aloud. The words seemed to come from afar, as though rocks had been thrown into a canyon and one had to wait for the series of crashes below. Then the imagined echo faded, and there was the silence in the room. O'Malley puffed noiselessly at his cigar. His eyes centered on McVeigh, seeking to extract the intent behind the words. "I've been in politics for almost 40 years, he said at last, his voice steady, "and that's the most serious charge I've ever heard. I know it, Pat. I've lived with this for 2 weeks now, and it's about to undo me. I've come to you only because you're the only one to go to. It's a long story, and I think you ought to hear it, all of it." O'Malley said nothing for a moment, then rose from his chair, went to the door, and called his wife. "Grace," he said, when she answered from the foot of the stairs, "let's put dinner off an hour or so if we can. Senator McVeigh and I need a little time to chat." "Don't worry, dear," called his wife. "It's only stew. It'll keep." O'Malley closed the door and returned to his chair, trailed by a funnel of smoke like an ancient steam locomotive. "All right," he said. "Let's have it." This time, unlike his session with Grissom, McVeigh told everything with names, omitting only the identity of Rita Krasicki. He began with the initial scene at Camp David, its intentional gloom and its wild, illogical outburst against O'Malley. He told of the similar eruption against Craig Spence, and again from another source of the causeless explosion over Davidge, the banker. Jim went into detail to describe his second session at Camp David when the grand concept was unveiled. He told of Hollenbach's glittering eyes, his tumbling speech, and his maniacal vow to use force if necessary against the nations of Europe. Then he recounted the events since his second eerie meeting at Aspen Lodge. Flip Carlson's trip, the quizzing by Luther Smith, the shadowing by federal agents, and even the questioning of Rita. Although he did not name her, he hinted at the intimacy of their affair and told of his talk with her that afternoon. The recital consumed more than half an hour. O'Malley did not interrupt, but he kept his eyes fixed on McVeigh, shifting them only occasionally to inspect the coils of smoke from his cigar. The room became hazed. Again there was silence while O'Malley squashed out the butt. When O'Malley spoke, his voice was keyed unnaturally low. "Jim, I wonder if you realize the impression you may convey by that story." "What do you mean?" "I mean that anyone listening to you might arrive at the conclusion that you're the paranoid, not Hollenbach." Jim felt the pit of his stomach go hollow. First Grissom, then Luther Smith, and now Pat O'Malley. "Good God, Pat," he exclaimed, and he realized at once that his voice squeaked with strain. He tried to resume a conversational tone. "Honestly, Pat, you don't think I'm nuts, do you?" "Look at the facts," said O'Malley, ignoring the question. "Here you are at age 38, a first-term senator, really a kid at this business, and you're running a write-in campaign for my job. Delusions of grandeur? And these investigations by the Secret Service and the FBI, the stories about being followed by fast sedans driven by inscrutable young men, persecution complex. And let's face it, young fellow, you're obviously in a highly agitated state." Jim found it an effort to throttle his emotions, to keep his voice on an even pitch. "Pat, since you won't answer my question, let me ask you another one. What sort of mood was Mark Hollenbach in that Tuesday night when he called you to the White House and demanded your resignation?" O'Malley looked startled. "Well, he was goddamn mad. Frankly, he blew his stack." McVeigh took a chance. "Flipped his lid is the common phrase for it, isn't it? And isn't it true that he accused you of trying to sabotage him by the way you handled your defense of the Jelinski charges? that you plotted the whole thing just to defeat Hollenbach in November, the same screwy charges he made to me about you. Well, am I right?" O'Malley bit his lower lip and fingered his jowls as he thought. "Well, yes, you're right. He really let me have it. If it had just been Jelinski and the Arena case, I'd have understood, but I thought his charge that I'd intentionally plotted his downfall was absurd. It didn't make any sense." "Of course it didn't," said McVeigh quickly. "It made no sense at all. And from a mind that prides itself on logic, Pat, that kind of accusation could only come from a warped mind. Take another thing. How about Hollenbach's weird idea for a national wiretapping law? That was no joke at the Gridiron dinner. The president told me at Camp David that he was utterly serious about it. Just imagine hundreds of FBI agents combing through all the private phone conversations in this country, and that from a longtime champion of civil liberties. It's not only idiotic, it's insane. For Christ's sake, Pat, admit it." It seemed to McVeigh that O'Malley was about to nod agreement, but checked himself. Instead, the vice president huddled deep into his chair, his full face brooding and his eyes staring at McVeigh. "Jim," he said, "let me ask you a blunt question. Why are you so anxious to prove that the President of the United States is insane?" McVeigh had the sensation that he was butting his head into mist. O'Malley's doubts were thick in the room, and nothing he had said seemed to have dispersed them. He wanted to lash out in anger, and again it was an effort to control himself. "Pat," he said slowly, very slowly, "believe me, I'd rather find my own daughter with a deranged mind than to have this forced on me. And why in God's name would I want to right now? You probably don't know it, but Mark called me into his office and said that he wanted me to be his running mate. I didn't start this vice presidential business. He did. It was all his idea. He proposed it and planned it. The write-in in Wisconsin is all his doing. I'm not exaggerating a bit. So obviously if I keep quiet now, I'll be vice president next January 20th. You know that, Pat? The Republicans don't have a chance against Hollenbach. So why would I want to spoil all that?" "That's what I'm wondering, Jim," said O'Malley quietly, "but I'm not getting an answer." "Now look, Pat, don't make me go into all that jazz about the system, the Constitution, and the country. Sure, we all honor them, but we do anything to preserve them, but it's more simple than that. I'm beginning to think of myself as a pro at this business, even if you don't think so. And as a tradesman, I don't want some crazy man running my business at the top." O'Malley grinned, suddenly for the first time since he'd poured the scotch. "You're talking my language," he said. He reached out for McVeigh's glass. "You need a refill, and so do I." When he fetched the drinks and seated himself again, O'Malley hoisted his glass and smiled. "I like you, Jim. I always have. No, of course I don't think you've lost your buttons, but that doesn't mean I come to the same conclusion you do. I'll grant you that Hollenbach has a mean temper, but Christ, man, I've seen a dozen worse in my time." "I'm sorry I can't describe those nights at Aspen the way they were," said Jim. His eyes, the way he looked, the gloom, and that torrent of words. "If you'd heard and seen what I did, Pat, you wouldn't be doubting." "Maybe, and maybe not," said O'Malley. "Another thing bothers me. Even if you're right, perhaps it's a temporary state," said Grissom. As Grissom indicated, "What makes you think that something has to be done right now?" "The meeting with Zuzek in Sweden, of course. I don't think a man suffering a mental ailment, or whatever nature of duration, should be representing the United States in any two-man conference with a guy as tough as Zuzek." "Zuzek? Sweden?" asked O'Malley. "What are you talking about?" "You mean you don't know about the summit conference for April 20th, that the White House has just announced?" O'Malley shook his head. "Nobody tells me anything in advance anymore." His small smile was bitter. "They don't even trust me around the arena these days." "The White House made the announcement about 5 o'clock, said McVeigh. "That's why I called you and said it was urgent. It is. We've got to stop Hollenbach from going to Sweden." "Assuming, that is, that your analysis of Hollenbach is correct." O'Malley unwrapped another cigar and went through his tedious ritual of lighting it. "Let's backtrack a minute. As I get it, there's only one person besides you who has observed Mark in one of these tantrums that you claim are evidence of persecution complex. McVeigh shook his head. No, two. You saw one instance yourself. You just admitted that. I don't count that, said O'Malley. That was just a case of a man who got so angry he said things he didn't really mean. But it's all part of the pattern, insisted McVeigh. Not if you don't concede the existence of a pattern. Good Lord, Pat, how much corroboration do you need? Well, for one thing, said O'Malley, studying a fat smoke wreath, I think if I were making a similar accusation, I'd be willing to reveal the name of the woman you say heard this eruption over Davidge. I can't, Pat. McVeigh's tone was pleading. I've told you we were very close. Isn't that enough? Why do I have to drag her into this? To say nothing of my wife. Ah, man and woman. And they talk about deceit in politics. O'Malley's voice trailed off. It occurred to Jim that O'Malley must be comparing his own situation to that of McVeigh's. He had been broken from the vice presidency for a violation of ethical standards involving finances, and now here was a young senator with only a fraction of O'Malley's experience being selected for the same office, despite an offense that both Hollenbach and O'Malley would consider more repugnant than O'Malley's own lapse. Jim could sense that this big, friendly man before him felt the injustice, and yet curiously he knew that O'Malley would never say a word about Jim's marital transgressions. O'Malley had his code. Man and woman relations were never to be mentioned. Jim, said O'Malley, I can't buy your conclusions, even though I know you're telling me the truth as you see it. But assuming for a moment that you're correct, why come to me? What can I do about it? That's obvious, Pat. You're the man who has the inability agreement with the president. As I understand it, and as I've read an awful lot of the situation recently, you're the only one who can act. And you're the one man who can invoke the disability clause. Clause? Asked O'Malley. You mean the disability thing in the amendment we put through a few years ago? Jim nodded. That provides, said O'Malley, that the president can declare himself in writing, stating he's unable to continue in office, or lacking that, the vice president can take over with the written consent of a majority of the cabinet. O'Malley took a sip of his drink and studied McVeigh over the rim of the glass. Obviously, you don't think President Hollenbach would put anything in writing indicating he's of unsound mind? No, of course not, replied Jim. But you can take over the presidency with written backing from a majority of the cabinet. O'Malley set his drink aside. His lips shifted his cigar to a corner of his mouth in a curious movement that left the cigar tilted belligerently upward. He stared at McVeigh and shook his head as though in rebuke. I guess you haven't thought this thing through, young fellow, he said. The provision we passed in the 60s after the hearings of the Birch Bay Committee was all right as far as it went, but nobody ever supposed it could be used to handle anything as complex as a mental ailment. A heart attack, a stroke, some obvious and apparent physical accident, sure. Then anybody can see the president is disabled, but this mental stuff is something else. It's all too hypothetical, too sticky. It's like trying to find a dime in a pot of glue, O'Malley shrugged. I wouldn't want any part of it, he added, even if I were convinced you were right. McVeigh persisted, despite his feeling of dismay. But Pat, paranoia, and that's what I guess it is with the president, could be even worse than a physical handicap. Imagine a paranoiac bargaining with Zhuchek or suddenly facing a major decision on the use of the bomb. I grant all that, said O'Malley, but look at the practicalities. How would you ever convince a majority of the cabinet on the evidence you have? There wouldn't be one chance in 10. In addition, the president, of course, would hear about it, and then there'd be sheer hell to pay. It would tear the administration apart. O'Malley blew a fat gray smoke ring which floated lazily upward and slowly disintegrated. Jim, watching it, felt his own hopes of action dissolving, yet he felt an inner compulsion to press on. You're talking about the Constitution and the amendment, said McVeigh, but how about your own special agreement with Hollenbach? Under that, you're required to act if you have evidence the president can't carry on his duties. Required, O'Malley snorted and looked at McVeigh in disbelief. You can't be serious, Jim. Have you read the agreement? Of course, said McVeigh somewhat tensely. O'Malley hoisted himself out of his chair and walked to the bookcase. He drew down a tan, ringed-back volume. This is my annotated volume of the Constitution, he said. Mark has the original of our agreement, but I keep my copy in front of this book. Here, read it. McVeigh took the paper. It was a single-spaced, typed-written sheet dated 3 days after the Hollenbach inauguration, signed in ink by both men and impressed with the presidential seal. Agreement between Mark Hollenbach, President of the United States, and Patrick J. O'Malley, Vice President of the United States. The undersigned state it to be their joint intention that under no circumstances shall the continuity of government be permitted to be broken by reason of inability of the President to discharge his duties. Even a hiatus of a few days might do irreparable damage to the nation. Following the precedent established by Dwight D. Eisenhower and Richard M. Nixon in the 1950s, and adhered to since then by their successors, the undersigned agree to the following. 1. That upon clear evidence that Mark Hollenbach is no longer able to discharge the duties of the office of President, Patrick J. O'Malley shall act promptly to set in motion the procedures provided by a constitutional amendment and by law. 2. That, upon such clear evidence, Mr. O'Malley shall in no case delay longer than 24 hours in carrying out his obligation under point 1 above. The undersigned have studied all prior agreements between President and Vice President and have taken special note of a letter written by former President Eisenhower to Senator Birch Bayh of Indiana on March 2, 1964. Mr. Eisenhower concluded that letter on the problem of presidential inability by stating, "There is, of course, no completely foolproof method covering every contingency and every possibility that could arise in the circumstance now under discussion. We must trust that men of goodwill and common sense, operating within the constitutional guidelines governing these matters, will make such decisions that their actions will gain and hold the approval of the mainstream American thinking. The undersigned realize, with General Eisenhower, that not every contingency can be foreseen. We have decided, therefore, to keep this agreement as embodied in points 1 and 2 above, as simple and as broad as possible, thus affording the utmost elasticity to cope with unforeseeable events of the future, while at the same time stressing the need for dispatch in ensuring continuity of government. The undersigned rely on mutual good faith and trust to carry out this agreement in the spirit of the Constitution and the laws of the United States of America, and they urge the citizens of the United States to accept this agreement in similar faith and trust. Signed, Mark Hollenbach, Patrick J. O'Malley." When McVeigh finished reading, he held the paper toward O'Malley, indicating the first numbered paragraph with a finger. "There," he said, "upon clear evidence you shall act promptly. It doesn't say may, it says shall. You've got no alternative. You're required to act." O'Malley shook his head and smiled gently. "Jim, you ought to have better sense than that. You're skipping over the most important words. Upon clear evidence. Clear evidence? What clear evidence do I have that Mark is unable to discharge his duties?" They were standing by the bookcase, and McVeigh grasped O'Malley's elbow, pulling the larger man toward him. "What the hell do you want, Pat?" His voice was rasped with frustration. "Jesus, do you need a medical report signed by 15 psychiatrists, or a vote of Congress, or an affidavit from the deans of Johns Hopkins Medical School, or something else that would take us umpteen months to get hold of? I tell you, the President of the United States isn't in his right mind." O'Malley pulled his arm away, slid the paper inside the book again, and replaced it on the shelf. Then he put his arm around McVeigh and guided him to his chair. O'Malley didn't speak again until he'd lowered himself into his own easy chair and taken another swallow of bourbon. Then his voice was low and friendly. "Look, Jim, I know the pressure you've been under, and I can imagine the anguish you've suffered before you could bring yourself to come talk to me. Believe me, I do. An outsider might not, but anybody in our business knows there'd be a lot of sleepless nights before a United States Senator would make that kind of charge that you have, even in private. But young fellow, you just don't understand the circumstances under which that agreement with Hollenbach was made. In the first place, I didn't have a thing to do with writing it. Hollenbach just called me in one afternoon, 3 days after the inauguration, and asked me to read it. He said the Attorney General had written a long legal document, but it was too cumbersome and complicated, so he'd just written one of his own. He asked me if I wanted to make any change. I said no, it looked all right to me, so we signed 3 copies and sent the last one to the Attorney General. Now, in the second place, I'll never forget what he said afterward. He said, "Pat, this thing is just for the record, and it doesn't mean a thing." He said he was of sound mind and body, that the only thing he'd ever had was a slight heart murmur some years before, but that it was all gone now. And then he added with a laugh that he didn't want me to ever try to invoke the agreement on mental grounds. He said he was no Woodrow Wilson and never would be. McVeigh had calmed as he listened. He rubbed the bridge of his nose pensively. "In my book, Pat," said McVeigh, "Mark Hollenbach is a lot worse off now than Wilson ever was. At least Wilson's trouble had a physical source. He'd had a stroke, and there was always the expectation that he'd recover. But with Mark, it's a psychic thing, a case of disordered mind that may never be set right again." "We're talking at cross purposes, Jim," said O'Malley. He was puffing on his cigar again, and his head tilted back against the chair. "You see, you're convinced that Mark's mind is deranged, and I'm not all that sure of it. And so we've come down to a basic dilemma of presidential disability that has vexed constitutional lawyers ever since the document was drafted almost 200 years ago. Let me go into a little history for you." O'Malley talked slowly and patiently as though instructing a college seminar. The vice president sketched the history of a dispute and an action over the inability subsection of the Constitution. He recalled how Vice President Chester Arthur had declined to assume the presidential duties, even though President Garfield lay wounded and almost inert for 80 days before his death from an assassin's bullet, and how Vice President Tom Marshall let Mrs. Wilson and the White House physician Cary Grayson virtually run the country during almost 2 years of President Wilson's incapacity. "No man," said O'Malley, "could ever act lightly in attempting to remove the President of the United States. The office, if not always the man, commanded a respect and an awe that almost amounted to reverence. And so it should always be," said O'Malley. As the vice president talked, his jowls wobbling and his fleshy hands waving points of emphasis, Jim realized how little he really knew of this Irish politician who resembled a cartoonist version of a Tammany boss. O'Malley obviously had steeped himself in the history of a vice president's relationship to his superior. What's more, he brought to the subject a sense of fitness and proportion that no amount of scholarly research could develop. Pat O'Malley, decided McVeigh, was a wise man. The vice president talked uninterrupted for half an hour. "I've always thought," he concluded, "that the best solution, there is no perfect solution, is the one we've got right now, the one enacted under the Johnson administration. It may be cumbersome, but it's workable." "It doesn't seem to be working now," observed Jim Riley. "The machinery's there," retorted O'Malley. "You just don't have the evidence or the confidence to use it. You want me to take the initiative, and I won't do it. I won't make a move any more than did Chester Arthur or old Tom Marshall." "Would you," asked McVeigh, "if you were convinced his mind was abnormal?" O'Malley flipped a lengthening ash into the green ashtray, frowning and studying the act as though it were a complex mechanical operation. He shook his head. "No, Jim, I wouldn't. Not without solid backing from the leaders of the party. In the special circumstance existing right now, a move like that would rip this country to pieces. Have you forgotten Art Jelinski and the Kennedy Memorial Sports Arena?" "No, of course not." "Well then, who do you think would believe me now?" O'Malley's tone was caustic. "They'd say I was an ugly old crook, bent on revenge for being dumped as vice president. And what about Hollenbach? Assume he's the paranoid you think he is. Why, he'd be patronizing and righteous, and he'd dismiss me as a meddling fool. Let's face it, Jim, the country would either drown me in ridicule or I'd be written off as a power-mad scoundrel who was trying to get even." It was a full night outside now, and Jim could feel his resolution being smothered in the folds of darkness. It was as though the last window light had blinked off in a blind alley. He made a final effort. "Look, Pat," he said, "you say you wouldn't invoke the agreement unless you had the solid backing of the leadership. I know you have reservations about everything I've said, but couldn't it be true that your doubts are compounded by your own particular position at this time? Suppose, then, you let me tell my story to a small group of leaders whom you'd name. The cabinet, we both realize, is too unwieldy and too prone, frankly, to leak anything that's said. But a small group could meet privately with a stipulation that everything said was off the record. Then, if the group didn't believe me, that would end it. But if they felt action was necessary, then you'd have real support to invoke the agreement and could go to the cabinet formally. Or maybe some further investigation could be figured out. What about it?" O'Malley showed interest. "That's possible," he said. McVeigh brightened. "Okay. Suppose you invited the three most influential men on the Hill, say Speaker Nicholson, Fred Odium, and the House Republican leader, to make it bipartisan." O'Malley bridled. "No Republicans," he said. "I'm not going to have any Republican listen to the kind of pure conjecture that's involved here." "But Pat," protested McVeigh, "this is a matter for the nation, not the party. Suppose you had to act. Suppose it came down to that. You'd want the support of both parties." "I'm not going to trust any Republican with that kind of ammunition in a campaign year," said O'Malley flatly. "I may have been thrown off the ticket, but I'm no turncoat. No, that's out." McVeigh beat a judicious retreat, but he refused to surrender now that O'Malley appeared to be in the mood. "All right, then," he said. "How about Grady Kavanaugh? He's got the stature on the Supreme Court, and he's one Democrat that everybody trusts." "Grady would be fine," agreed O'Malley. "And besides, he's got a great mind for sifting evidence. Frankly, I'd place a lot of reliance on whatever he thinks of your story." And so it was settled. They talked about the arrangements and both agreed that if Kavanaugh assented, it would be best to hold the meeting at his country home. Kavanaugh was a widower who owned 200 acres with a farmhouse on a high hill overlooking St. Leonard's Creek, about 60 miles from Washington. The Supreme Court justice spent his weekends there. The place was isolated and secluded, set off from the main highway by thick woods. This was a Monday night, and they agreed on Thursday night for the meeting, if it was convenient for the others. O'Malley accompanied McVeigh down the stairs and through the narrow hall on the front door. Grace O'Malley leaned out the doorway. "Do you two connivers realize it's 9 o'clock?" she asked. "You've been talking, or drinking, for more than 3 hours, and Pat told me he was through with politics." "But we're not through with him, Grace," said Jim. I can smell that y'all aren't. Say hello to Martha for me, Jim." At the door, O'Malley shook Jim's hand in a friendly grip. "Jim," he whispered, "I can tell you right now that your story won't be believed Thursday night unless you can produce the woman who can tell us about Hollenbach and Davidge." "Pat, please," Jim pleaded. "I mean it." Jim frowned. "We'll see," he said.